I went to my grandson's engagement dinner at the Peninsula Hotel in Chicago carrying my late wife's wedding ring, the one I'd promised to pass down to whoever he chose to marry. But at the private dining room doors, my own daughter stepped in front of me. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who wandered into the wrong room and said, "Dad, this is a family-only event tonight. There was a mix-up with the seating. You should head home." 40 guests turned to stare. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask twice. I said, "Of course, sweetheart," turned around, and walked back out through the lobby into the cold. I got in my car, sat in the parking garage for exactly 4 minutes, and then I called my accountant. By sunrise, my daughter's world looked very different than it had the night before. Before I go on, tell me where you're watching from tonight, son or daughter. Doesn't matter. I'd love to know. And if you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the very people you built a life for, hit that like button for me. My name is Walter. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 41 years building something out of nothing. I thought I was building a legacy for my family. Turns out, I was just building a target on my own back. Let me tell you how it happened, from the very beginning, because you deserve to understand exactly what these people did before you find out exactly what I did back. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Cicero, Illinois, the youngest of 4 boys, and I learned early that nothing in this world gets handed to you. My father worked the line at a steel plant for 32 years and came home every night smelling like iron and sweat, and he never once complained about it in front of us. That was the lesson he gave me without ever saying a word. You carry your weight, and you carry it quietly. I carried a paper route before school. I bagged groceries after school, and by the time I was 19, I had saved enough to buy a used pickup truck and a stack of tools. I started doing small electrical jobs for neighbors, then small contractors, then eventually I incorporated my own company, Voss Electrical Systems. It took me 11 years to get my first real commercial contract, wiring a shopping plaza on the north side. It took me another 15 after that to turn Voss into one of the largest commercial electrical contracting firms in the Midwest. We wired hospitals. We wired airports. We wired half the office towers you'd recognize if I told you their names, which I won't, because some habits from 40 years in business never leave you. My wife's name was Diane, and she was the reason any of it mattered. I met her when I was 23, at her cousin's wedding, and I remember thinking that she had the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer. We got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard, because that's all either of us could afford. And I promised her that night that one day I'd give her the kind of life neither of us grew up with. I kept that promise. We had 2 children. Our daughter, Renee, born the same year I signed the lease on my first real office space, and our son, Peter, 4 years after that. Diane ran our household like she ran everything else in her life, with warmth and with an iron will underneath it that most people never saw until they crossed her. She used to say that money was a tool, not a personality, and she raised our kids to understand the difference between what you have and who you are. I believed she'd succeeded. I believed that for almost 40 years. Diane passed 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March. Gone by August. I will not stand here and describe to you what those 5 months did to me, because some things a man keeps for himself. What I will tell you is that after she died, something in me went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. I threw myself into the business because the business didn't ask me questions I couldn't answer. I stepped back from day-to-day operations 2 years ago and handed the reins to my longtime partner, Sal, but I stayed on as majority owner and chairman. The company was worth, by conservative estimate, around $90 million. I tell you that number not to impress you, but because that number is the reason for everything that happened next. Renee is 42. She's married to a man named Craig, who sells commercial real estate and has never, in the 15 years I've known him, failed to mention how successful he is within the first 10 minutes of a conversation. They have one son, my grandson, Tyler, 24 years old, recently engaged to a young woman named Ashley. I have always loved Tyler the way you love a grandchild who reminds you of yourself before life wore down your edges. He used to ride along with me on job sites when he was 8-9 years old, wearing a little hard hat I bought him, asking me 100 questions about electrical currents that I answered as best I could. I paid for his private high school. I paid for his degree in finance at Northwestern. In full. No loans, no complaints. When he told me 2 months ago that he was proposing to Ashley, I cried, actual tears, sitting alone in my kitchen, because it felt like watching a piece of Diane continue forward into a future she never got to see. The engagement dinner was supposed to be a small, elegant gathering at the peninsula, 40 of Tyler and Ashley's closest family and friends. Renee had asked me 2 weeks prior if I would give a short toast, and I had spent hours writing it, revising it, because I wanted it to be exactly right. I wanted to tell that room what it meant to watch this family continue after everything we'd survived. I brought Diane's engagement ring with me that night, the one with the small emerald flanking the center diamond, because Diane had made me promise, in one of her last clear-headed conversations before the morphine took most of her words away, that Tyler's future wife should have it. Not sold, not appraised, not given to anyone else, she told me, gripping my hand with more strength than I thought she had left. Promise me, Walter. I promised her. I had been carrying that ring in my coat pocket for 2 months, waiting for the right moment to give it to Tyler quietly, man to man, before the dinner began. I arrived 20 minutes early, the way I always do, because my father taught me that being on time is actually being late. I straightened my tie in the hotel lobby mirror, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something close to happiness. I walked toward the private dining room, and I could hear the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, soft jazz playing underneath it all. And then I saw Renee standing at the door, and for one foolish half-second I thought she was waiting there to greet me. She wasn't smiling. She stepped fully into the doorway, blocking it with her body in a way that felt deliberate, rehearsed almost, like she'd practiced standing exactly there. "Dad," she said, and her voice had a strange flatness to it, the voice you use with someone you're managing rather than someone you love. "This is a family-only event tonight. There was a mix-up with the seating, and honestly, with everything going on, I think it's better if you head home." I stood there for a moment, genuinely confused, because I could see over her shoulder into the room, and I could see my own name written in careful calligraphy on a place card at a table near the front. "Renee, I have a seat right there," I said, keeping my voice even. "I wrote a toast for your son." Her jaw tightened. "Craig's parents are sitting there now. We had to make some adjustments." She said the word adjustments the way you'd describe rearranging furniture, not removing a grandfather from his own grandson's engagement party. I looked past her one more time, and that's when I saw Tyler at the head table, laughing at something Craig had said, not even glancing toward the door, and something in my chest went cold and still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. 40 faces in that room, and not one of them was looking for me. I understood, in that instant, that this had been decided before I ever walked into that lobby. I did not cause a scene. 40 years of boardrooms taught me that the man who raises his voice has already lost the room. I looked at my daughter, and I said, "It's fine, Renee. Tell Tyler I love him." Then I turned around, and I walked back through that lobby past the piano player, past the concierge desk, out into the January cold, and I did not look back once, though every part of me wanted to. I sat in my car in the parking garage on Michigan Avenue for exactly 4 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't felt since the week after Diane's funeral. It wasn't grief this time. It was clarity. I thought about every wire transfer, every tuition check, every down payment I had quietly covered over the past decade without ever once being asked to. I thought about the ring in my coat pocket, still there, still meant for a boy who hadn't even noticed his own grandfather had been erased from the room. And I thought, with a calm that surprised even me, that if my family had decided I no longer belonged at their table, then perhaps it was time they learned exactly how much of that table I had been paying for. I did not call a lawyer first. I called my accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Malhotra, who had managed my personal finances for 11 years, and who I trusted the way you trust very few people in this life. She picked up on the second ring, hearing something in my voice immediately. "Walter, what's wrong?" "Priya, I need you to pull every account I hold jointly or in trust for Renee and Craig. Every one." Tonight, there was a pause, then the sound of a keyboard. The home equity co-signature, the business loan guarantee for Craig's brokerage, the education trust for Tyler, the standing monthly transfer to their household account. "That's 4 separate instruments, Walter. That's a lot to move at once." "Move all of it," I said. "Tonight, if the systems allow it. First thing tomorrow if they don't. I want every guarantee revoked and every discretionary transfer frozen before Renee wakes up tomorrow morning." Priya was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the caution in her voice when she spoke again. "Walter, before I do this, I need to ask you something. Because once this moves, It's very hard to undo gracefully. Are you certain? This isn't a small gesture. Revoking the loan guarantee alone could put real pressure on Craig's brokerage financing within days. I looked out through my windshield at the dim concrete of the parking garage. Priya, my daughter just told 40 people I wasn't welcome at my own grandson's engagement dinner. I gave that boy everything I never had. I am not angry. I am done being invisible in my own family's story. Move the money. Understood, she said, her voice shifting into the same clipped, professional register I imagine she used with every serious client. I'm pulling the guarantee documents now. I want you to know something else, though, while I have these accounts open. She paused, and I heard papers shuffling on her end. Walter, I've been meaning to bring something to you for the last few weeks, and I kept telling myself it could wait. Looking at the household account activity for Renee and Craig, there are transfers I don't understand. Large ones. Coming out of the education trust you set up for Tyler. My chest tightened. What kind of transfers? 6 figures, Walter. Over the last 4 months. Routed through the trust, out to an account I don't recognize. I assumed it was tuition-related, but Tyler graduated 2 years ago. There's no tuition to pay. I sat very still in that parking garage, feeling the cold settle deeper into my bones than the January air alone could explain. Freeze everything, I said quietly. And Priya, pull the full transaction history on that trust going back 2 years. I want to see every dollar. I'll have it for you by morning, she said. Walter, I'm sorry. I should have flagged this sooner. You're flagging it now, I said. That's what matters. I drove home to my house in Winnetka that night, in silence. No radio, just the hum of the engine, and my own thoughts circling the same question over and over. What had my daughter and her husband actually been doing with money that was meant to secure their son's future? I didn't sleep more than 2 hours that night. I sat in my study, the same study where Diane used to bring me coffee while I worked late, and I waited for the sun to come up. Priya called me at 7:15 the next morning, and I could hear in her voice that whatever she'd found had rattled even her composed professional exterior. Walter, I need you to sit down for this. I'm sitting. The trust for Tyler had $840,000 in it as of 18 months ago. As of last week, it has $11,000 remaining. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. The withdrawals were authorized using a power of attorney document. Walter, it lists your signature. I felt something drop through the floor of my stomach. I never signed a power of attorney for that trust. I hold sole trustee authority. I know, Priya said, which means either someone forged your signature or someone had access to a document with your signature on it and attached it improperly. Walter, I think you need a lawyer before you need an accountant at this point. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is potentially fraud. I called Marcus Whitfield that same morning. Marcus had handled Voss Electrical's corporate legal work for nearly 2 decades, and beneath his tailored suits and easy courtroom charm was a mind like a steel trap. He arrived at my house within the hour, and I laid out everything Priya had found across my kitchen table, the same table where Renee had done her homework as a girl. Marcus went quiet as he read through the transaction printouts, his expression darkening with each page. Walter, this power of attorney is dated 14 months ago. Do you remember signing anything around that time? I thought back, and then it struck me, cold and sudden. Renee brought me paperwork for a storage unit lease. Said Craig needed my signature as a co-guarantor for a business storage space he was renting for overflow inventory. I signed it in her kitchen. She had several pages, I remember, and I didn't read every single one closely. Diane had just passed a few months before that. I wasn't reading anything closely in those days. Marcus's jaw tightened. It's possible she buried the power of attorney authorization inside a stack of unrelated documents and had you sign the whole packet at once, banking on you trusting her enough not to scrutinize it. Walter, I've seen this before, and I'll tell you honestly, it usually isn't a first offense. People who do this once have usually been circling the idea for a long time. That single sentence sent me back through years of small moments I had never once questioned. Renee mentioning, almost in passing, how tight things were for Craig's brokerage after a slow market year. Renee suggesting gently that perhaps it was time I simplified my estate planning, that a man my age shouldn't have to manage so many accounts himself. Renee bringing over documents just for my file, always with a pen already in hand. I had read every one of those moments as love. I was beginning to understand they might have been reconnaissance. There's something else, Marcus said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. I did some preliminary digging into Craig's brokerage this morning, before I even came here, because a business loan default of the size you're guaranteeing tends to leave a paper trail. Walter, Craig's firm isn't just having a slow year. Public filings show 2 lawsuits from former clients alleging misrepresented investment returns and a pending state licensing board complaint. If that license gets suspended, his entire firm collapses, and every loan you've personally guaranteed comes due, in full, immediately. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my own kitchen for a long moment, feeling 4 decades of careful, hard-won discipline settle over me like armor. "So let me understand the full shape of this," I said slowly. "My daughter and her husband have been draining my grandson's education trust to prop up a failing brokerage. They forged my signature to do it, and then, rather than come to me honestly when the money ran short, they decided the cleanest solution was to remove me from the family entirely, starting with uninviting me from my own grandson's engagement dinner so that I wouldn't ask questions, and so that eventually, I imagine, they intended to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs before I noticed any of this at all." Marcus didn't disagree with a single word of it. "That's precisely the pattern I'd expect to see, Walter. And if I had to guess what comes next, it's a request for you to sign over broader financial authority, framed as help, as convenience, as someone looking out for you in your golden years." I thought of Diane's ring, still sitting in my coat pocket from the night before, meant for Tyler's future wife, and I felt something harden inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. "Marcus, I want everything documented, every transaction, every forged signature, every lawsuit against Craig's firm, and I want to know one thing above everything else before we move a single step further. I want to know whether my grandson had any idea where his own education money was going." "I can find that out," Marcus said. "But Walter, are you prepared for what you might learn? I've spent 3 years since Diane died learning to be prepared for things I never wanted to know," I said. "Find out." It took Marcus 4 days to get the full picture. 4 days during which I did not answer a single call from Renee, though she called 11 times and left messages growing progressively more anxious, moving from cheerful cover stories about the dinner mix-up to a tone I hadn't heard from my daughter since she was a teenager caught in a lie. On the 5th day, Marcus sat across from me again, this time in his own office downtown, with a folder considerably thicker than the first. "Tyler didn't know," Marcus said, and something in my chest loosened slightly at those words. "We confirmed it through a former assistant at Craig's firm who left under bad terms and was willing to talk. Tyler believed his education trust had simply been fully spent on his tuition and living expenses over the years, which was a reasonable assumption, and nobody ever told him otherwise. He has no knowledge of the forged power of attorney. He has no knowledge of his father's pending lawsuits. As far as we can tell, Walter, your grandson is exactly the young man you believe him to be. He simply trusted his parents, the way any 24-year-old would." I felt tears come to my eyes for the first time since that night in the parking garage, and I did not try to stop them. "Then he's the only one in that family who hasn't lied to me." "There's more," Marcus said, his tone shifting back into something graver. "We also found the source of the money going into that mystery account Priya flagged. It wasn't just going to prop up the brokerage's operating costs. A significant portion, nearly $200,000, went toward a down payment on a lake house in Wisconsin, purchased 8 months ago, under Craig's name alone. Renee's name isn't even on the deed. Walter, I don't know if your daughter fully understands the extent of what her husband has been doing with that money, or whether she's a knowing participant, but either way, the person who blocked you from that dinner room door is either complicit in fraud or she's being used just as thoroughly as Tyler has been, and either possibility should concern you." I sat with that for a long moment. 41 years of building something from nothing had taught me many things, but the hardest lesson of all was this. Sometimes the people closest to you become strangers slowly enough that you never notice the exact moment it happened, only the terrible clarity of the morning after. "Here's what we're going to do," I said finally, and Marcus leaned forward, pen ready. "First, I want the forged power of attorney formally invalidated and reported. I want that on record with the state, regardless of what happens next in this family, because I will not have a fraudulent document with my name on it sitting in some drawer waiting to be used again. Second, I want a full asset freeze on every account I've guaranteed for Craig, effective immediately, and I want his brokerage's lender notified that the guarantee is under legal dispute. Third, I want Tyler brought into a private meeting, just the 2 of us, before anyone else in this family knows what I've uncovered. He deserves to hear the truth about his own trust fund from me, and not from a courtroom filing. And Renee? Marcus asked. I thought of my daughter as a little girl, 4 years old, insisting on carrying her own lunch pail to preschool because she wanted to prove she was a big girl. I thought of her at 22, crying at her own wedding because Diane had cried first. I thought of her, 3 nights ago, standing in a doorway with her jaw set, telling her own father to go home. Renee gets one conversation, I said. One chance to sit across from me and tell me the truth, the whole truth, before I decide what happens to the rest of the guarantees she and Craig are depending on. If she lies to me one more time, Marcus, there won't be a second chance. Renee came to my house 3 days later, at my invitation, looking thinner than I remembered, dark circles beneath her eyes that told me the pressure had already begun closing in on her from directions she likely hadn't anticipated. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Dad, she finally said, her voice cracking. Craig's firm is being investigated. The bank called about the loan guarantee. Everything is falling apart, and I don't understand what's happening. I studied my daughter's face carefully, looking for the calculation I had learned to recognize in Craig, and searching instead for the terror of someone genuinely blindsided. What I saw looked far more like the second than the first. Renee, I need you to answer one question honestly, and I will know if you're lying to me, because I have spent the last 8 days learning exactly how good you and your husband have become at it. Did you know that Tyler's education trust was drained to cover Craig's business losses and a lake house purchase? The color drained from her face entirely. A lake house? Dad, what lake house? I watched my daughter's composure shatter in real time across that kitchen table, and I believed, in that moment, that whatever complicity she bore in blocking me from that dinner room, she had not known the full depth of what her husband had built beneath her feet. Renee, why did you tell me not to come to Tyler's dinner? She put her face in her hands, and when she looked up, her eyes were red. Craig told me you'd embarrass us in front of his business partners who were there that night, potential investors for the brokerage. He said you'd bring up the loan, or the guarantee, or ask questions in front of people whose money he needed. He said it would only be for one night, and that we'd explain it to you after, once the deal closed and things settled down. Dad, I didn't want to do it. I stood in that doorway and I felt sick doing it. But Craig said if the investors got spooked, we'd lose everything, and I was scared. And I am so ashamed of myself right now I can barely look at you. I sat back in my chair, feeling the last remaining doubts settle into a clear, hard understanding. My daughter had not orchestrated the fraud, but she had been willing to sacrifice her own father's dignity to protect her husband's failing house of cards, and that, too, was its own kind of betrayal, even if it wore a more forgivable face than forgery. Renee, I said quietly, I am going to tell you exactly what happens now, and I need you to listen without interrupting me, because I have earned that much after 41 years of never once asking anything of this family that I didn't give back tenfold. Craig committed fraud using my signature and drained your son's future to cover his own failures. That is now a matter for the authorities, and I will not shield him from the consequences of that, regardless of how it affects you. What I can control is what happens to you and to Tyler. I am setting up a new trust, in Tyler's name alone, funded directly by me, with a trustee who is not you, not Craig, and not open to being circumvented by a forged signature ever again. And I am asking you, Renee, not telling you, asking you to consider very seriously whether the life you're protecting by staying loyal to Craig is a life you actually want to keep protecting. She cried for a long time after that, and I let her, because some things a father can only sit through, not fix. The confrontation with Craig happened 11 days later, in Marcus's downtown office, with 2 representatives from the lending bank present and a state financial regulator who had been quietly looped in once Marcus filed the fraud report. Craig walked in wearing his usual confident smile, the one he'd worn at every family dinner for 15 years, while explaining to anyone who would listen exactly how successful he was, and I watched that smile falter the moment he saw the folder sitting on the table in front of my seat. Walter, he said, forcing warmth into his voice that didn't reach his eyes. I wasn't told you'd be joining this meeting. I own the guarantee your firm's survival depends on, Craig, I said, my voice level. The same voice I'd used for 4 decades in boardrooms, far more hostile than this one. I believe I have every right to be here. Marcus opened the folder and slid the forged power of attorney across the table, along with the trust withdrawal records, and the deed to the lake house in Wisconsin. Craig's face went through several colors in rapid succession, landing finally on a pale, sweating gray. "This isn't what it looks like," he started. "It looks like fraud," Marcus said flatly. "Because it is fraud. Forged signature on a legal document. Unauthorized withdrawal from a minor's education trust. Structured over 18 months to stay under reporting thresholds. Mr. Delgado, the bank representatives beside me are here to inform you that your loan guarantee is being formally withdrawn effective today, which means the $420,000 currently outstanding on your brokerage's credit line comes due in full within 30 days. The regulator beside them is here because forging a financial power of attorney is not simply a family matter, it's a felony." Craig looked at me with something between desperation and disbelief, the look of a man who had built his entire identity on being the smartest person in every room and was only now realizing the room had turned against him completely. "Walter, please, we're family. Whatever happened, we can work this out privately, quietly, the way families do." I leaned forward, and I thought of Diane's ring in my coat pocket, still waiting for a boy who deserved a family that told him the truth. "Craig, you looked me in the eye at my late wife's memorial service and told me you'd always look out for Renee and Tyler as if they were your own responsibility to protect. Instead, you forged my signature, drained my grandson's future, and had my own daughter block me from a doorway so I wouldn't ask questions while you built yourself an escape hatch on a lake in Wisconsin. There is no quiet, private version of that story where you get to keep pretending to be the man you told me you were." Craig's brokerage license was suspended by the state board 6 weeks later, and the criminal fraud case, once filed, moved forward with the kind of momentum that comes from clean documentation and a cooperating victim. I did not take pleasure in watching it unfold, not the way you might expect from a man who'd been so thoroughly wronged. What I felt instead was something closer to relief. The particular relief of a man who has spent 3 years since his wife's death, quietly wondering if he still mattered to anyone, finally understanding that the answer had simply been buried under people who valued what he could give more than who he actually was. Tyler came to see me 2 weeks after everything came fully into the light, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table, looking younger and more lost than I'd seen him since he was a boy. "Grandpa," he said, "I don't even know what to say to you. I'm so sorry. I had no idea any of this was happening." "I know you didn't," I said. "None of this was ever your fault, and I need you to hear that clearly, because I know exactly how heavy guilt sits on a person's shoulders when they've done nothing to deserve carrying it." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. "Ashley and I talked about postponing the wedding. Everything feels so uncertain right now, with my dad and everything that's happening." I reached into my coat pocket, the same coat I'd worn to that dinner 9 weeks earlier, and I set Diane's ring on the table between us. "Your grandmother made me promise this ring would go to whoever you chose to marry. Not sold, not appraised, not caught up in anyone else's mess. She believed in the two of you before either of you had even met. Don't let anyone else's failures decide the shape of your future, Tyler. Not your father's, and not mine." He picked up the ring carefully, turning it in the light the way I remembered Diane turning it herself, decades earlier, in her parents' backyard. "Grandpa, will you still walk me down to give a toast at the wedding? I want everyone in that room to know exactly who built this family." "Son," I said, and my voice caught in a way I hadn't expected it to, "there's nowhere else in this world I'd rather be standing." Renee and Craig divorced 4 months later. Renee moved into a smaller place near the lake house, which was seized as part of the fraud restitution and eventually sold, with the proceeds returned to Tyler's new trust. She calls me every Sunday now, something she hadn't done consistently in years, and we are, slowly, rebuilding something that resembles trust, though I've learned at 68 that trust rebuilt after betrayal grows back scarred, sturdy in its own way, but never quite the same shape it was before. I still think, sometimes, about standing in that hotel lobby, straightening my tie, feeling happier than I had in years, only minutes before my own daughter told me to go home. I think about how close I came to simply accepting it, the way I'd accepted so many small erasures over the years in the name of keeping the peace. But Diane used to tell me that peace built on silence isn't peace at all, it's just delayed honesty. And somewhere in that cold parking garage on Michigan Avenue, I finally understood exactly what she meant. If you're watching this tonight, and somewhere out there, a son, a daughter, a grandchild, someone you built your whole life around, has ever made you feel like you no longer belonged at your own table, I want you to hear this clearly from a man who has lived through it. You do not have to raise your voice to be heard. You do not have to beg for a seat that was always rightfully yours. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away quietly, make one phone call, and let the truth do what your patience alone never could.